Hi again, it's Jason from Fraser Valley Rose Farm, and I have my hand pruners with me. I have my pruning saw and I have my loppers. So I guess that means this is a pruning video right in the long days of midsummer. And you'd be right to point out that oftentimes, at least on roses, I've recommended late winter, early spring pruning because you get a chance to see that damage that came from the winter, and you'll also have that long spring season for a gentle recovery of your plants. But there are situations where it totally makes sense to do a midsummer pruning, both for timing on the plants and to get extra blooms out of your plants, the kind of pruning we call deadheading, but also structural pruning on once blooming shrubs, where this is really the best time to do it. I'll be going through that on roses, on shrubs, and some perennials today. Hope you stick around. I'm going to start out spending some time in this video talking about repeat blooming roses and deadheading on something like this, Daybreaker, a wonderful hybrid tea. But while I'm talking about this, I should assure you that I also want to go in depth onto once blooming roses and shrubs that bloom just once. I'm going to place some timestamps on this side of the screen here, just to show you when I'll be proceeding into those topics in case you're more interested in that than on the repeat blooming roses. So this is a repeat blooming rose, as I mentioned, called Daybreaker, hybrid tea. Wonderful color on that, and you always should start all of your pruning activities with your goals in mind. And with something with this much color on it, I would say that the primary goal, the first goal, would just be for cleanup and quick return to bloom. And I want to do that without robbing all of the rest of the blooms from here. So it might make sense in this situation just to reach in like this from the side and gently pinch off the spent blooms, just to make it look a little bit less unsightly on the completely spent blooms. And also, as I pull off those spent flower heads, the rose won't spend so much of its energy trying to mature the seed heads, and therefore it will encourage the plant to repeat the next flush of blooms sooner. But I'm doing all of that without taking off the fresh blooms or robbing the plant of all of its color. If you're like me, you may find that that hand pinching of single blooms is a little bit more time consuming than you want to spend on it, and you may actually wait until the entire head of blooms is past its prime and then go and snip off the whole thing. Moving the camera down a little bit then to the bottom of that flower cluster, you can see that each area where a bloom comes out has its own little flower stem or flower stalk on it. So you have to go back at least to the point where they all join back up here on the main stem. However, I'm looking here, and following that rule that I've shown you in previous videos about leaflets of 3, above that point it is considered part of the flower, more or less, but this leaf here has leaflets of 5. So you'd want to cut back to above a node where there's a leaflet of 5. So in this case here, a leaflet of 5, and that's where I cut above on the stem, just to ensure the fastest return to flower. Staying with the concept that you should start with your goals in mind, have a look at this rose here, and what I can see on here is that this stem here has gotten way far ahead of the rest of the shrub in terms of its growth. It's out of balance now. So aside from just wanting a quick return to flower, at this time it's also a good time that I could look at balancing out the shrub and bringing it back down. So something like this, a cut like that, helps to balance out the shrub. I can deadhead the rest of it as well at a more moderate level, but any stems that have gotten out of place, gone off too far in one direction, interfering with an aisleway in your garden, that's a time to address it. There may in fact be other reasons why you'd decide to go beyond just the basic snipping of the flower heads and go a little further back down on the shrub. As mentioned, shape and balance is one of them. Overall size of the shrub is another. Health, if you ever find any dead, diseased, damaged, crossing, or little weak spindly stems in there, it's a good time to remove them while you're deadheading. In this case, the reason I'm going to go a little further is because I'm greedy and I like to propagate roses. So pulling out a stem like this, a little lower than just the flowers up here, gives me a chance to prepare some of these stems as cuttings. And so you may recognize from my other propagation videos that that is about exactly right for a cutting under my domes, and I can make a new plant right out of that. So far, I've been talking about repeat blooming roses, but this rose here, Dagaso, is a once blooming Gallica rose, which I would not have pruned first thing in the season because pruning at that time would have cost me blooms. You can see that it blooms on old wood and blooms heaviest down in that lowest portion there. But you can see here, this is in fact its final flower of the year. After that, it is done. So your right time to prune for old garden roses is now, just as they finish up their bloom period, so that you can clean them up, improve their structure, and set them up for success into the next year. I once heard people say that old garden roses don't love a heavy pruning. And sometimes you have to give them what they need, not what they want. And in this case, what I don't like about the form of this, you can see it's doing this kind of weird lion's tail thing, at least in its young growth, where it shoots up this stem and then it has a whole bunch of growth right at the top here, but it's kind of bare down here. What you can look in this section here is you can see it has actually fresh new stems coming from the base. So it definitely has enough vigor to go ahead and take care of that and refresh from the base and give us a good bloom next year. So I'm going to focus on giving this a good structure, and that means that some of these tall things have got to go. So I'm going to aim right down low into the base of this thing and remove some of these lion's tails and get them out of the way, kind of knowing that maybe the plant will resent it a little bit, but I don't want to tolerate that form in the garden here over the long term. So I'm getting rid of those, and I will also do a cleanup of some of these stems here, just to get rid of the flowering stems. I may do a little bit of thinning around the base here as well. So let me do some of that and then show you what I want the final result to look like on this plant. Getting down to the base of it now, I can now see on the inside of the shrub, and I've thinned it out to a number of good, strong, newer looking shoots while removing some of the oldest and crustiest of growth. And what I'm hoping that will do is it will allow stems like this and these newer growing ones to become firmer and more upright, and to hold the weight and the distribution and the balance of the shrub a little bit better going into next year. And on a young plant, that's kind of what I'm looking to do, is to train it to be a little bit more open and a little bit more controllable. Here's another old garden rose. This one's called Henri Matin, or red moss. And this one is obviously finished its bloom cycle as well. And it has a few stems like this one here, and let's say this one up here, that are kind of out of shape. Well, it is sending a bunch of fresh new shoots down at the base here that are meant to refresh it for the following year. Just one other slight note here is you can see that it's escaping its container, or bottomless container, that tire there, and it's sending out suckers, which I may dig up later and actually even sell. So it's doing some propagation for me. But let me give this one a quick reshaping as it finishes out its flower cycle, and I can set it up to be a nicer shape for next year. And there you go. Got rid of some of the oldest and crustiest stems and set it up to have some nice, fresh, new growth for next year that should build a more vigorous and sturdier framework, is what I'm hoping. Moving on to spring blooming shrubs, or early summer blooming shrubs now. This is a deutzia, and I use this as my example because it's in the same stage as some of those old garden roses, where this is the final of its flowers for the year and then its finish, which makes this a really good time to address anything you need to do in terms of shape, size, and health going into next year. In this case, it's a fairly young shrub, so I may do a little bit of pruning on the inside just to open it up and to get rid of the long branches on the top, but I don't have to do a whole lot. Now this is also the right time for things. This is a deutzia, weigela, some hydrangeas, currants. A lot of the spring blooming shrubs are finished their cycle now. Pruning right now would give them a chance to recover again before winter, put on some new growth so that you will have flowers next next spring, you wait much longer and you'll be cutting out the potential for flowering next year. Well, there are lots of perennials in the garden just coming into bloom now, and I wouldn't dream of chopping them off before their prime. But looking over here, you can see in this border that the salvia has been in bloom for a while. And as I focus in on it a little closer, I hope that what you can see in the color of this is that the part of the bloom that is very bright purple up here is starting to become less prominent than the large portion of the flowering stem that is turning duller and browner, and it's basically finished. This would be a good time to consider chopping it off. Now you can see on some of these buds, if you look on a stem, I'm going to pull it back here, that there are some smaller side or lateral shoots that are starting to develop flowers. Now what I'd like to do is give it a prune back a little bit lower, as I've started to do down in this area here. And that's just giving it a cut right here down to the canopy of leaves but not flowers, so that you can allow these side shoots to start to develop into new flowering stems, and you get a whole new flush quite quickly, as the members of the mint family, this being salvia, are prone to do. Other members of the family like Nepeta and Agastache will do that equally well if you're prompt about it. Okay, that's all I had for you today on the topic of mid-season pruning or summer pruning. At least when it comes to the repeat blooming roses, they behave a little bit more like the annuals and perennials, that being that if you deadhead them now, you'll get more color later in the season, and it's a good opportunity to get in there and cure any structural problems or health problems as they develop on the rose through the season. When it comes to those things like the once blooming roses or the spring blooming shrubs, it's also a good time to get in there with your pruners or your blades and give them a trim up so that you can benefit the health and give them sturdy growth, well-shaped growth going into the following season. So the moral of this story is, don't be afraid to touch your pruners during the summer season, despite the admonitions that spring pruning is better. If you have any questions about this, drop those into the comments below the video and I'll see what I can do to help.